I spent today at the hangar, and I'm truly impressed. It's my first visit to Amman, to Jordan, and it's a beautiful country, it's a beautiful city. There's some colleagues here that I've known and not seen for very many years, and so it's very exciting to be part of this. And if this is what your normal week here is like, it's heaven. Closer? Oh yeah, okay, that sounds good, sorry. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our firm in Boston. And while we consider ourselves designers and artists, we're also an architecture firm. So some of the work that we do is installation work, and some of it is building, and sometimes the two are mixed. We're located in Boston. We have a small studio in New York, and we have a gallery in the front of our studio in a storefront where we sometimes exhibit our work, and we oftentimes exhibit the work of local artists and collaborators. It used to be a sculpture studio in the turn of the 20th century, and it's a perfect space for a design studio because the light is wonderful and there's lots of space. These are some of the people who work with us. We have a young and very talented office. I'm constantly reminded how young they are and how old I'm getting. But it does allow us to stay in touch with some of the very contemporary ways of thinking as far as design and making. The downstairs portion of the studio is where we keep the shop, where we keep the fabrication. And interestingly, as you have a maker space here, some of those very same tools are we using in our office. In the upstairs space is where all the designers sit, and there's a lot of up and down between the two. Oftentimes we take our architectural projects and we test pieces of it by building what we call a mock-up. So you can see for this house that we just finished in Washington, pieces of the railing were built in the basement, sometimes successfully and sometimes not successfully, and that allowed us to actually test it before the final construction. Sometimes we actually build and design our own work. If the project is small enough, we can do the counters and the millwork. We have some large fabrication machines which are good for prototyping, but not for a huge mass production run. But if something is small enough, like a store, which we recently did one for Aesop, which is a skincare line, we built a number of their stores a couple of years ago, and we're able to actually build them in our office, take them apart, and then rebuild them. If this plays, you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, we just finished installing a desk in one of our projects. This was a picture of being fabricated in our basement. We had to make a sort of a spray booth, which is probably a little bit illegal, but it involved a lot of big fans and ventilation so that we could paint all of the pieces, finish them, and then build them in layers. For those of you who are working in CNC routing and digital fabrication, you're no stranger to this idea of the layering of pieces. And some of actually, there were a couple pieces I noticed in the front of the exhibit that is using this very same technology. Other times we use fabrication to test out things in order to keep them in the project. And by that I mean every project goes through what we call value engineering. There is a time when they built this museum when they took the drawings out and they priced them because the client needed to know how much will this cost. And sometimes unusual architectural elements will be seen as very expensive. This is one case where we were trying to build a very different and mannered ceiling and came back with a pricing, and the contractor said, this will be much too expensive. This will be $1 million to build the ceiling. And we were devastated because that was really the heart and soul of the project. So we built it in our basement in full scale with normal light gauge steel studs, normal plasterboard, just to show that indeed it could be built. This is a rendering of what it was supposed to look like, and here's the actual construction. In the basement, we also took a piece of the ceiling and built it just to show that indeed it could be done out of normal materials. And here's a sample of it. Again, it was just one section, but at full scale, and it was able to help us show the contractor that it was not going to be difficult to build. We work in a number of different scales and different kinds of projects. We work in academic projects, so schools and universities, University of Toronto, MIT, University of Melbourne. My partner, Nader Tehrani, who very much would have liked to have been here as well, is the dean at the Cooper Union in New York, and he's a real visionary for our firm. He actually kind of is the vision behind most of our projects, and while we have a team working together, it's very much because of him that we've been able to become the firm that we are. So some of these projects were a little bit older and actually have finished. University of Melbourne, University at Georgia Tech, and then this is Toronto in the corner. We use a lot of 3D visualization tools to help us show clients what a project's going to look like, but also to help us know ourselves. We also work at a larger scale, and we've been doing a number of housing projects. The construction market in the United States right now is better than it's been in a very long time, particularly in the Northeast. So we do have a couple of housing projects. One is for private condominiums, one is for graduate student housing at MIT, one is for subsidized housing in our own neighborhood, and then we've got a project in Cleveland that I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. I wanted to show this. Abir, who's in our audience, worked on the model for this project years ago. It's an art center in China. It's called Tongqian. And it's actually a project by Office Da, which is the predecessor to my firm, some of the early work of Nader's. But it really is, it's a good project to show our process and how we think about materials. I like to feel that Nada's work looks unique in each project, because we have a similar process, but we always start with the material and the program. So in this case, it was very much about the brick and what brick can do, and it can brick bend, or can brick have texture. Other projects that you'll see, this is an actual gas station in Los Angeles. This was for British Petroleum when they were a more sustainably minded program that they were working on. They wanted to do a truly green gas station. So this was about a kind of a metal and how could it be bent, but also how could a gas station become a civic center on a strip in Los Angeles. Oftentimes we work on projects much like you see in the hangar for this week in Amman Design Week, where they are pure installation projects, where they may be more sculptural. We do that both to help us work with new materials and begin to think about the means and methods of putting them together, as well as to keep us connected to a world that we like to be in, which is one of the arts. That when we get too far away from that, I think we forget why we went into the field in the first place. So what you're seeing here are a variety of exhibitions. Some of these things were only up for a day or two. Some of them are standing as permanent. For MIT's 150th birthday a few years ago, we did a very large inflatable balloon with interactive technology. This was only up for 2 days, and then it was taken away. MIT owns it, and they can reuse it at will. This was for the Gwangju Biennale in Korea, and this is a permanent civic piece for them. This is a transportation piece for the subway system in Boston, and this was a very early sculpture of Nader's for Office Da, which was at MoMA in New York. We do quite a bit of work with 3D printing as well. We've tried to launch products from that, have yet to be successful with taking anything to the truly mass market, but you're seeing some 3D printed stainless steel silverware, as well as some mock-ups for a series of door handles that we're working on. The firm that is Nada truly means nothing for those of you who speak Spanish. It just is nothing with a few extra A's on it. And the story behind that is probably has something to do with the fact that nada.com was already taken, so nada.com might have been taken, but by the time you got to 3 A's, got it. So before Nada was Office Da, and Office Da was a firm that Nader and colleagues started after the GSD, where we had all gone to school. And these were some very early pieces, and I like to show them because when this work was done, people didn't have CNC routers. No one had seen a 3D printer in the office. the firm was really doing some work with materials and sculpting all of these by hand, all of them by layers. And it really was part of a movement that connected material and the kind of entrepreneurship about making with architecture. And I think that that's really been a legacy that NADA has carried on. One of the things I joke about is that I feel like we're in the era of the makerspace. Suddenly, in the last few years, almost every project that we have has a makerspace, whether it's a library, a public school, the MIT project that I showed you, which is graduate student housing. There's this real belief that the makerspace is not only something that belongs to architecture and artists, but actually fulfills a community spirit as well. And it's gotten me thinking about why is that? Why are we in this period of making? What is it about the makerspace that seems to answer so many of our social needs? I was thinking about the Industrial Revolution in the US at the turn of the 20th century and how what a game changer it was in the way people could begin to buy and sell goods. There was a movement right around that time called the arts and crafts movement, which rebelled harshly against the Industrial Revolution because it felt like people had lost craft. They'd lost the ability to make things. They'd lost that sort of human experience of having people do handcrafted goods. What maybe they weren't thinking, or maybe they were, was that what was actually happening was that people who couldn't have afforded these things suddenly could. So while those that could afford it would sort of seek out something like the green and green handcrafted arts and craft movement of their architecture or their goods, things were about to change and probably never change back again. Post-World War II in the US even was another bit of a game changer because suddenly people who couldn't have afforded their own house really could. So you saw this mass kind of exodus from cities into the suburbs where housing was built with a speed that had never been built before, and goods to furnish those houses were also being built equally quickly. There was a movement at the time of modernism where you saw some really excellent design work and really some of the best of what we call the brutalist movement internationally, certainly not in the US and maybe especially not in the US. But what happened to the US was that they kind of took this and they took maybe all of the really elegant and kind of light about it, and it became this almost dehumanizing experience where we had this for better or worse, we'll call it a cognitive capitalism, where most people were now trying to get into a white-collar office kind of a workspace, a job that kept them away from touching things and making things and building things, and more likely you were going to be sitting in a desk in a cubicle, and what does that mean for people? So a funny thing started to happen in the 70s where some of the really big thinkers in computers, people out of MIT, people like Stuart Brand, people like Steve Jobs, were suddenly showing up on this kind of back to the land movement, where these guys that were designing supercomputers that was sort of all about the technology that was here to come were suddenly promoting this catalog called the Whole Earth Catalog that was this real kind of back to the land, sort of come back to sort of what is essential about being a human being. And there were many products that this catalog sold, but two of them that showed up in the very same issue were these. One of them is the Vermont cast iron stove, and the other one was the first Apple computer. I'm not sure if this was the actual first Apple computer, but for people of my generation, this was probably the first computer any of us owned. So most of you look far too young to have one of these sitting in your basement, but I have one. I've seen people turn them into fish bowls and do really great things with them, so I don't think that the Vermont cast iron stove really took off, but this company went nuts. So suddenly, out of this catalog that was sort of all about sort of the essence of humanity, you were seeing these really big thinkers, people that were going to change not just architecture, but all business as we know it, kind of tied to this simple movement. If I zoom ahead to where we are now, we're seeing things like this MakerBot, which you've got a couple of them in there, everywhere. You may have them at home, and if you don't, maybe you soon will. They're coming down in price, they're very portable, they're very easy to use. What does that mean, and why are we using it? Well, I can't answer that sort of for all of you, but I do know that it's changed the way we work in our field. We're a firm of about 25 people. We do some very small things, we do some very large things. But even when we're doing it at the sort of very largest scale, we're still looking at the detail. So this was something that we made last summer. Right about this time, we were working diligently designing this catenary cloud structure. And the idea behind it was that while each one of these pieces is in compression, like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and the pieces will lock together without glue and without screws, and it will freely hang in a space much like the hanger. And we worked all summer to design it, and then we worked for weeks to fabricate it. And we did models, we did all kinds of computational models, and we digitally fabricated it. Each individual piece was cut on the CNC router. Each individual piece was fit together and then in a scaffolding. And about 3 hours before the unveiling, as we rented scaffolding, and scaffolding costs about $10,000 to rent for a weekend, which I had no idea. It's extremely expensive. So of course they wanted to come get it back. And just as they were pulling up, we pulled off the scaffolding, and this is what happened. So can you imagine what it would have been like in the hangar just before the press showed up, just before everybody gets there? We pull off this kind of infrastructure that's supporting it, and all the pieces fell off, because as soon as one piece came, they all came. So this sort of would have been seen as a failure by just about anyone else, but because this is what we do and kind of how we work, unbelievably the group took it all with a grain of salt and took every single piece and they glued it in place and they put several screws in so that it could actually hang back and do what it needed to do. So in the end, actually, you would not have known unless you actually got up close that it wasn't doing what it meant to do. But it does show you, and we'll talk about this a little bit toward the end of it, that no matter how much computation we do and how much modeling, when it comes to actually making it, there is still that human factor. There is still sort of that essence of failure. So the research that we do needs to be tested, retested, and retested before it probably makes it into the mass market when you begin to see it in architecture like this. Most of the time, we do not experience that kind of catastrophic failure. So some of the early mock-ups I showed you in the first slides have actually gone on to be very successful projects. This was a house that we recently finished in Washington, D.C. It has a tremendous amount of millwork that was crafted in a CNC router, all of which sort of goes from the part to the whole, where the very details of the thing and the whole come together into something that is somewhat like a concert that was so carefully orchestrated and meant to hang together as an architectural whole. And this is a picture of the finished house. In the end, though, as architects, one of the things we really try to do is make place. It's not necessarily only about the craft and the joint, but it's actually about the place and the people who use it. So in the end, it's mostly successful when it meets the program and when it solves a problem for the client. Because architects, in the end, architecture is a business, and people come to us for something that needs to be successful. So the experimental piece of it is only one part of our practice. Getting back, however, to this idea of the maker movement, this is one such client who felt that the maker space and that kind of ethos of learning through coding was going to become part of their whole curriculum. This is a 6th through 12th grade school outside of Boston called the Beaver Country Day School. This school was built in the 1920s, and it was a lot of different separate buildings on a very beautiful site in Brookline, Mass. Because it's made of a bunch of different buildings, all the floor heights are different. So if you're in a wheelchair, if you have difficulty getting around, it's going to be challenging to get from building to building. So the real problem here was making the building accessible, and that's why the project existed in the first place. But the other issue is that they are a school of makers and that they've really changed the curriculum. So as soon as kids enter, they're coding in almost every class. So even in math class, you're writing code. This is quite radical. Some of you may have heard of High Tech High in Los Angeles. Sometimes these things show up on the news or in film, but in general, it's very rare that children are coding in their elementary and high school curriculum. So for this school to be, it's really quite something. In order to become part of that ethos, it meant that the spaces of the school, the places where people circulate and hang out when they go to the library, need to all become part of that. So these are where people do their research. It's where they do their making. This is actually an accessible ramp, but it's also a place where students get together and work on small projects. Again, the whole genesis of the architecture is about putting one long ramp that connects all of the different buildings together. But within that, there are spaces of art gallery space. And again, you know, it just, the linkages are what make this project successful. Shown in all different colors are various different wings that have floors at different elevations. So the unification of these things spawned the addition, which is what we're now calling the R&D Center, or the Research and Design Center. A section through the new space shows the old 1920s building with an addition that we've added, new classrooms upstairs, a library which is rethought of as what a library can be. Most of the books are actually downstairs in deep storage, and most of this space is for research and collaboration in various different kinds of media and computation, while the basement is one large maker space and layout and design space. This just begins to show you some of the ideas of what space making can be, so that using whiteboards and using interactive screens and to be able to change these things because every teacher wants to use it slightly differently. It's under construction right now and hopefully will be open for the academic year next September. These are some renderings of the upstairs space. So looking outside, some of the books, but there aren't very many. They cut their collection in half. And then what some of the spaces and workspaces would be like. In our work, you're going to see a lot of visual connection. That's something that we find when designing for creative spaces. People really like to see and be seen when they're working. I think it inspires creative people to both feel comfortable and be willing to take risks, and also to learn from each other, because I think really at the time of a young student's life or a young artist's life, sometimes your peers are your best teachers and collaborators. Like some of the projects I showed you before, like some of the research, we do a lot of work in model, and we still do, even though architectural models are more rare now that we have the kind of software that allow people to visualize things in computer. When I started, we were always building models, and now almost no one commissions them, so when we build them, we end up building them for ourselves. This is a large-scale model. When it sits on a table, it's about that tall. And the reason that we built it was to look at the exterior envelope. And it's a theme that you're going to begin to see in a lot of our work. When you're building in a country, when you look at the buildings that you have here, there's a style that makes sense for this market, for this weather, for the labor that you have that can actually build a building. It's no different where we are in the region that we are. You have a market that can build a certain way. So we know that and the limitations of it, but within that we try to bend things as much as possible, working with what we call the means and methods of construction. So this is testing a wall system to make sure that the building will stay dry, that it will be cool enough in the summer and warm enough in the winter, that we meet code as far as how the building envelope should perform. And as we begin to model those things and we begin to test them, we also begin to visualize them to help the client see what they will be like. Because when we take this to the market and we show this to the contractor, he or she will say, oh, that's going to be very, very expensive to build. So it's important that we draw in every way, that we show them that it's really just the same simple parts that you would build if it were flat. But this is the kind of center courtyard of the Beaver School, of the R&D Center, and very important that the architecture begins to express what's actually going on in that school. Another school with a very different scale, a very different budget, is the Melbourne School of Design. This opened 2 years ago in Melbourne, Australia. This was a collaboration with another firm, and we collaborate with other designers and other firms often. Sometimes they're creative partners, and sometimes it's more of a business relationship to help us execute our work in a foreign country or in a state that we might not be licensed. In this case, it was a real collaboration. You had 2 firms that had a commitment to good architecture, good design, and doing something different for the Melbourne School of Design. What's interesting about this is that the client is as much of the designer as the architects are, and in our very best projects that is true, that we look at what they want and we continue to iterate with them. Because it was a design school, the dean of this school wanted it to be what he called a pedagogical building. And by that he meant that when students came to this school, and they're usually undergrad and graduate students from Australia and other parts of the world, they wanted them to use the building as a teaching tool. So what is it about the building that's sustainable? Why does every elevation look the way it does? How is light modulated? These are the questions that we asked as we were beginning to form the design. When you're putting a building into an existing campus, you just can't build as if you're doing an object in a field. There are different faces on each side. So for anyone who's ever been to that campus, you know it's a dense one, and that there are traditional Victorian and Gothic buildings all around. So the different faces were meant to respond to that context, but they're also meant to respond to the sun and to the wind. And so each face of the building is a little bit different. The screens that were used to be able to modulate sunlight so they would still get good sunlight but without a lot of heat gain. Also, it's important that when you do a new building to make it contextual, and by that I mean that it doesn't mimic, but it should complement the buildings near it. So it meant to be sensitive to it in scale. Having lots of space, both outdoors and indoors, for people to congregate, like the space that we're in right now, is very important. And Melbourne has a much more temperate climate than New England. So the importance of having outdoor-indoor spaces was important. The other thing is that when you do a building in the middle of a campus, you want to draw the campus in. You want the other people to come in. You want the historians and the economists and the sociologists to come in, and they need a reason to do so. So you begin to think about those programs that you can put on the ground level, the libraries, the cafes. An interesting story here is that when people see the building, they assume it was a renovation, but it's not true. There was something built into the donation for the building, that there was this neoclassical bank facade that had been in downtown Melbourne for years, and it was critical that it was, or not critical, it was written into the donation that this was going to have to actually be built into the wall system. So this is called the Joseph Reed facade, and it is nested into this highly contemporary building in such a way as it doesn't look awkward, but it certainly looks different. One thing to not to take too much of a diversion on, but we also try to do a lot of work with prefabrication. That when you can have things that are constructed outside of the field, it's much easier to control the schedule, but also the quality of the piece. So the Melbourne project was one of our most successful in terms of schedule and budget. It was finished 6 months early and kind of right on the money. I attribute that to both the way it was delivered, and they do it a little differently there than we do in the US, but also to the fact that they were willing to prefabricate a whole bunch of the architectural pieces. A number of the wall panels, the ceiling as it went in, were all trucked in and kind of assembled as a whole, which is quite different than if you're building these things from scratch on the site. It involves many fewer trades, and it's a little bit easier to control. I'm going to try this animation. We have a couple of these. Let's see if I can do it. Nope. We do a lot of work with animation in our office, and I'll probably skip through some of these as they start to run long. But this begins to show the various systems in the building of sustainability. So getting back to that idea of the pedagogical building, how can the architecture begin to inform the people that are in it to make them understand how much energy that building is actually using? So what the material was made out of: recycled timbers, prefabricated concrete, perforations in the zinc so that they could allow in sunlight but stop the heat gain. This cross-laminated series of timbers were what made what we call the hanging studio. We actually had to find desk space for the students on the perimeter of the circulation. So that hanging element that you see is what we call the visiting critics studio. But the rest of the space is for students on the perimeter. Let's see if I can get out of this. Sorry about that. Let's see. Okay. All set, thank you. So this just begins to show some of the process of the fabrication. I'll move through these quickly. But again, much easier to control when someone's bringing it in and assembling it than if they tried to build all of that on site. These are some views of the school as it's now occupied, and what you begin to see behind this mesh are, these are actually the desks for the students. They use a term called hot desk, and what that means is something actually you're noticing in your own workplace with this kind of hoteling, that the desk that you use for that day is not your desk forever, so it allows more people to use the building. This was a great boon for the school because they could afford to grow the program but not actually grow the building. This just shows kind of a diagram of what that's like, but these are all the spaces that the architecture students would have studio. But what's really happening is that their desks are in that perimeter space around the great atrium hall. And then what's happening back here are smaller seminars and research spaces, because there are a good number of researchers and PhD students in this university. Another project we have is at the University of Toronto, and this is a public project, so while it started at the same time as the Melbourne project, it has much less money, much less ability control, and 4 years after it started, it's still going. So every month I think we're almost there, but I actually don't think they'll be open in this for school year this year. I think it'll actually be one more year. It does have an interesting story, though. It's a heritage building. It's a Gothic building in downtown Toronto. And for those of you who've been to Toronto, that's some wonderful old Victorian buildings. This was a Gothic building that had been a college, then a military hospital, and then some sketchy science in the 60s where there were all kinds of animal testing. And then the University of Toronto bought it in the 80s. They never did much to it. They let the fine arts students use it for about 15 years without ever upgrading it. And then they finally said the architecture students could have it. I'm going to try this video one more time. Let's see if I'm a little more successful. Okay. So this is downtown Toronto. Lake Ontario is down here. Much like Amman, it's extreme, maybe not quite as dense as Amman, but it's a very dense city. The university is actually up here. This building defined a new corner for the University of Toronto, and in fact, in such a way as the city of Toronto thinks of this as their building. So very difficult to renovate it because it's considered a historic structure. So you just can't go in there and change everything every time you move a window or you move a door. So doing a contemporary addition to it was very challenging. It needed to be Gothic in spirit, which is why you begin to see some of these really sharp corners, but it also needed to be very sensitive to its landscape. The landscape becomes part of the building because it's located on a crescent, because it's in the round. This building has no back. So unlike its previous life, where you had this kind of front looking out in the lake in a very grand gesture down what they call Spadina Avenue, now there's a whole new north face that begins to carry the campus forward. This is a school of architecture, landscape, and design. So it's not just architecture. So the landscape begins to define what the building can be. Okay, that was easy. Like the Melbourne project, this one also needs to be overtly sustainable. When your clients are actually designers and architects themselves, there's a higher level of sophistication because every time you present the project to them, everyone is an expert. So in some ways it's very rewarding because you get a lot of feedback that's very useful. In some ways it's very hard to it's like pushing string because everybody has their own agenda. In this case, the client was wonderfully collaborative and also had a dean with a real vision, much like the Melbourne project did. Sometimes it helps to have a leader who has a singular ability to kind of push it through. In this case, the form was not only meant to be Gothic in spirit, but actually the building had to perform. So the roof captures rainwater, the roof brings in fresh air. The air system was originally to be fed underneath, but actually in the end we opted for a radiant system of panels. So the radiant heating and cooling was to take place in that ceiling that I showed you. 5 minutes? Whoa, I gotta hustle. Okay, thank you. So this is what it looks like on the outside. You think about a device which we call a street. So the street is the ability to bring the public through your building. This is that first floor I talked about, which everybody can come into, but I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. It's funny, time really flies when you're up here. We are working on an auditorium, and I just want to bring it back to our office where we have mocked this up in real scale, just to make sure they can afford it and show that it can be built simply. If we figure if we can build it, so can they. These are some housing projects, but I'm going to move through those, and if you have questions, we can come back to them. We are doing a large housing project at MIT with a bunch of different architects. This involves the city of Cambridge. This is no small feat, but it's also about doing an envelope, which is iconic and really of the spirit of MIT, which is some of the finest and provocative architecture in the US, certainly in Massachusetts. We also have a project I mentioned in Cleveland. This is a developer budget. This is not a lot of money and very quick. In the true spirit of NADA, we want to make it extraordinary, but we're working with very inexpensive materials here. So we're trying to get some luminosity through color, but these are just cheap metal panels. This is meant to be millennial housing. So for those of you who are millennials, you know who you are. They're really targeting first-time home buyers. So these are meant to be affordable and flexible and allow people to be social. This is more market testing. These are what some of the units look like. This is the Hinman Research Center. I'm just going to move through the slides and we can come back to them. This was a munitions plant that was turned into an architecture school. So they had a high bay crane and they used that for studios. It also becomes a campus center where they hold events, fundraising, the Beaux-Arts Ball, film series. Okay, can you join me? So one of the really wonderful things about, I'm going to hold this. You're going to hold that for me?
No, you talk.
Okay, one of the wonderful things about being here was it's a true collaboration. So I had not met Raya since until yesterday, but she has been in our office in spirit for how many weeks?
Like, not weeks, more like months.
More like months. So we've been working on this project. And Sahel, who curated the whole exhibit, is a very dear friend of Nader's. He's also a peer and a colleague. So it was such an honor for us to be here. I never imagined what would come out of this. And I'm going to show a few of the images, and then I'm going to ask Raya to talk about how we actually did it. Because very much like the catenary cloud that I showed you earlier, you can model and you can test and you can think you know what you're doing, but in the end it's all about the making. And that is still very true no matter how much technology we put on these things. So these are early renderings just to show what it would look like in the hangar and test various configurations. If you haven't seen it, please do. It's extraordinary. I actually think it looks just like the drawings, but.
These are the digital renderings of it.
So, can you talk a little bit about what this is?
Yes. This is where the name of our installation comes from. It's a knitting technique that looks like a woven. It's done through the use of 1 yarn and 2 knitting needles. It's called entrelac. This stitch is called entrelac. It's one of the most complicated knitting stitches that you'll ever try if you're a knitter. And that's just, it reminded us so much of this complete package, but with much more negative space. This is a model that's his office put together. It was his, Cindy, and Mira that did it, and it helped us a lot with installation. Even though when it came to actually deal with the wool stretches, all of our points shifted, and maybe we can go to the slide that it showed.
Which one? Do you want it to all the?
Yeah,
Yep.
all of the, this is our finished product. Sandbags that hold our weights on the floor. Okay, so this is, we worked for months and months and months with Nada, I worked with Nada, to put together these very specific points and intersection and overlapping layers, but when we went up in the scissor lift for like the 5 days that we were putting it together, we kept noticing that the points were just not working. So even though we spent a week marking our points, we had to eliminate our points, and we had to do it on site, take a tape measure from truss to first point, try to get it as even as we could in the round, and then move forward and enlarge it. Prior to actually getting up on the scissor lift and suspending it on the truss, we measured, checked, labeled, and pre-stretched our strands twice.
How many strands? 28?
28 strands that then were attached into 14 doubles that were then attached side by side to create 7 quads that then were ready to go up on the truss. And funny enough, the first time we put them up the opposite way. So we did it twice.
That's what it looks like.
We kept everything rolled, which was like the most manageable process to like, because it was humans that were throwing it over the truss and over the metal. We kept everything rolled into wheels like you saw on the other image, and we kept it rolled till about 1 day from the opening. We spread them out, and they had already been filled with the sandbags, and they were set. We just played with them on the ground, and that's how we got entrelac to happen.
It's beautiful. Well done.
Thank you.
We're very proud to have been part of it. So that's basically it. Just to round out, we are a firm that is about 20 years in existence, with the beginning by a vision of my partner Nader with a firm called Office Da. The legacy of the firm has been built over a spirit of making and materials and testing and recombining things in extraordinary ways. But we hope that some of this begin to show you that actually the part to the whole relationship is so critical in architecture, that some of the work that's being done here, some of the things that the kids were doing today, has a real meaning as far as the spaces that we will ultimately begin to inhabit. Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure to be here. I don't know, were you do questions? What were you? I'll just ask you. Did anyone have any questions? No one interrupted me. I was hoping that you would. Not one? Thank you. Here.
Hi. I don't quite know the right vocabulary, but I'm curious to know how like low environmental impact construction and making is changing at all the way that you approach these designs. And is it changing the way you approach the visual aesthetic as well? I mean, is it something that maybe didn't look as beautiful once you understand that it's to, you know, protect the natural environment? Does that change what you consider beautiful even, or what kind of visual aesthetics that you would go for as a firm?
Yeah, so I consider that a two-part question. On the one hand, how do we see that it's changed the way things are built? I must confess that I'm a little disappointed in that. I don't think that it's changed very much the way that we build things, but it's certainly changed the materials that we build them from. However, the construction industry has been one of the slowest to move along. So even though there are marvelous ways to create things and prefabricate things, by and large, most of the buildings that you see under construction, particularly in a hot real estate market, are being done the same way. So transportation intensive, maybe that's gotten a little bit less since sort of local sourcing, but in general, not as much as one would hope. For the second part of the question, I think it's changed a great deal what we think is beautiful. I mean, suddenly we understand that an all-glass building is actually not necessarily a good building, and we begin to see it differently. When you're doing a building, certainly in our climate, you don't actually want more than about 40% of that wall of the entire building to be glazed. So it begins to change what you think of as a beautiful building. Same way with the landscape or how the building occupies the landscape. I showed you in the Toronto project, the idea that you can see a building in the round, the shape of the roof is all about the capture of water or all about capturing northern light and not southern heat. That certainly changes things. And when people can see that, when there's a literacy about it, that's really wonderful, because then that's when the architecture is really doing its job. I mean, centuries ago, architecture was the literacy, sort of long before people could read, or it would really tell a story, and it doesn't really do that now. If a building now can tell that story about how we use our resources, that's really changed things. So some of the sort of really fine architecture that you're beginning to see is all about that. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much for coming. It was really very nice.